What is your race?
Black, full-blooded. All four of my grandparents were slaves. But I'm a full-blooded American, too.
Why did you give up music and begin writing?
I didn't give up music, but I became interested in writing through frequent reading. In 1935, I discovered Eliot's The Waste Land, which moved and intrigued me, but defied my understanding. And I wondered why I had never read anything of equal intensity by an American Negro writer. Later on, in New York, I read a poem by Richard Wright, who perchance came to town the next week. He was editing a magazine called New Challenge, and asked me to try a book review of Turpin's These Low Grounds. On the basis of this review, Wright suggested that I try a short story, which I did. I tried to use my knowledge of riding freight trains. He liked the story well enough to accept it, but just afterwards the magazine failed.
But you continued to write?
Yeah, with difficulty. At the time was the recession of 1937. I went to Dayton, Ohio, where my brother and I hunted and sold game to earn a living. At night I practiced writing and studied Joyce, Dostoevsky, Stein, and Hemingway, especially Hemingway. I read him to learn his sentence structure and how to organize a story. I guess many young writers were doing this, but I also used his description of hunting when I went into the fields the next day. I had been hunting since I was 11, but no one had broken down the process of wing shooting for me, and it was from reading Hemingway that I learned to lead a bird. When he describes something in print, believe him even when he describes the process of baseball or boxing. He's been there. It's not because Hemingway was white or accepted that I admire him. I don't feel the need, as many Negro writers do, to restrict myself only to other Negro artists.
How did you come to write Invisible Man?
I came to write Invisible Man as a result of a failure. I had conceived of a novel during the time I was going to sea during the Second World War. I was working as a second cook and baker on merchant ships, but somehow the Rosenwald Fund had granted me a scholarship to work on a novel. And I had a novel. It was a wartime novel where a Negro flyer comes down, gets captured by the Nazis, and is placed in a detention camp where he is the highest ranking officer. He was the highest ranking American, and then you had the Nazi, who was philosophically minded and who pitted this American against the other Americans. Well, it was such a bad passage that I came back to the States absolutely through with that particular idea. But one thing led to another. I was somewhat ill in the Merchant Marine Hospital and people told me to get a rest. And I went to a friend's place in Waitsfield, Vermont. And while there, certain things that I'd been doing, reading, thinking about came into focus. A sort of unconscious focus, as often happens when you're writing something. One morning, scribbling, I wrote the first sentence of what later became Invisible Man. I am an invisible man. And I played with that, and soon enough, in the period of 6 years or so, I was published.
Would you consider your novel a purely literary work as opposed to one in the rising trend of social protest?
I see no difference between art and protest. They're inseparable. However, I wasn't, and am not primarily concerned with injustice, but with art. Critics complain about Negro protest novels, but I believe their main problem is not the protest, but their limited scope.
But isn't it going to be difficult for Negro writers to escape a limited scope when their literature is concerned with the minority?
All novels are about minorities. The individual is a minority. The universal in a novel is reached only by depicting a specific man in a specific situation. The greatest difficulty for Negro writers is the problem of revealing what they really feel, rather than serving up what Negroes were supposed to feel and were encouraged to feel.
What is the universal in your novel?
It's a novel about innocence and human error, a struggle through illusion to reality. Each section contains a definition of his identity, or the social role he is to play as defined for him by others. But all say essentially the same thing. As I put in the novel, keep this Negro boy running. Before he could have some voice in his own destiny, he had to discard these old identities and illusions. His enlightenment couldn't come until then. Once he recognizes the hole of darkness into which these identities put him, he has to burn them. He must assert and achieve his own humanity. He can't run with the pack.
How do you relate this, Ralph, either positively or negatively, to the notion that the Negro movement of our time is a discovery of identity?
I don't think it's a discovery of identity. I think it's an assertion of identity. And it's an assertion as part of a larger American identity. It's revealing the identity of people who have been here for a hell of a long time.
Do you think a reader unacquainted with the Negro experience can understand your work?
Yeah, I think so. The understanding of art depends finally upon one's willingness to extend one's humanity and one's knowledge of human life. I've noticed, for example, that the Germans, having no special assumptions about American Negroes, dealt with my work simply as a novel. I think and hope Americans will come to view it that way in 20 years, if it's around that long.
Do you think it will be around?
I don't. It's not an important novel. I lacked eloquence, and many of its immediate issues are rapidly fading away. If it does last, it'll be simply because there are things going on in its depth that are of more permanent interest than on its surface. I hope, anyway.